the 7th month dies, let's talk about the boy who lived, and how he sucks at math. Spoilers for all 15 books and films in the Harry Potter series. Snape kills Dumbledore. Alright, we good? Okay, moving on. So, being the massive Potterhead that I still am, after finishing the series, I realized there was something missing. Well, honestly, there were a few things missing, but particularly something that didn't add up. Quite literally. And that was the number of known Horcruxes. We know from both books and films that Voldemort intended to make 7 Horcruxes, and upon simple count, he did, in fact, make all 7, so no problem, right? Well, no, there is a problem, because there should have been at least 8. Follow me on this. It's been speculated that if Voldemort hadn't been an utter and complete diva, Harry would have had no chance of defeating him. If he'd chosen 7 random pieces of lint and dropped them into the ocean, Harry would have basically had no hope of defeating him. But being a prima donna, Voldemort chose very important objects and put them in symbolically important places. Now, why 7? Well, it's the magic number. Young Tom was never one to do things halfway. He was going to be the most magical person who always had 7 magical Horcruxes as insurance. Make note of my use of the word always, as that's going to come up later.
Always.
Oh, Merlin the feels! Not like that! Now, let's go through the timeline as we know it. It's likely, although never confirmed, that Tom Riddle's diary was the first of his Horcruxes. There are a few things to support this. Firstly, we know it was made during his time at Hogwarts, specifically while he was trying to strut his stuff as the heir of Slytherin. It was in fact Moaning Myrtle's death that facilitated the creation of this particular item. It's also likely his first, as it's the most mundane item of all the Horcruxes. There's no real symbolic significance to the diary itself, likely due to the sudden nature of the event. Myrtle's death was not premeditated. She happened upon him in the bathroom as he was unleashing the basilisk. Interesting to note also that his control of this creature was enough to count as a mar on his soul that it killed under his command. In any event, Tom likely chose a random but slightly meaningful object that just happened to be in his school bag at the time. The next Horcrux was likely the Gaunt Ring, unwittingly also the Resurrection Stone, but Tom was not aware of that. What he did know was that the ring was a family heirloom on his mother's side, and he used his murder of his own father to turn it into something useful to him. This event also took place sometime in Tom's youth, likely not long before or after his graduation from Hogwarts. So that's 2 down. Now I'm going to talk about 3, 4, and 5 in quick succession because they are linked. When Tom was in Hogwarts, he was a very charismatic boy that made friends wherever he went, and especially when he thought he could use such connections to his advantage. This included the friendship of the Grey Lady, the ghost of Ravenclaw Tower, and more specifically, the ghost of Rowena Ravenclaw's daughter. In the story in the book that was drastically trimmed for the film, Helena, for that was her name, was jealous of her mother's infamy and stole her diadem in hopes of obtaining its wisdom. She fled to Albania and was pursued by her suitor, who killed her in a jealous rage when she snubbed him. He then committed suicide in his guilt, and his ghost also haunts Hogwarts as the Bloody Baron. The diadem remained in the hollow tree in Albania by the site of both of their deaths. While Tom likely learned of this story while he was in school, it would likely be many years before he would be able to pursue such a line of investigation, as travel to foreign countries would not have been in his budget as a poor orphan child. So put a pin in that one right now, because we have to raise money after graduation somehow, right? In his youth, he worked for Borgin and Burkes and came across a woman by the name of Hepzibah Smith. He promptly murders this woman so he can get his hands on a couple of her treasures, including both Slytherin's locket and a cup of Helga Hufflepuff. His prompting to murder her might have been simply greed for these items or an indignant rage that the locket had been obtained by shortchanging his desperate mother, who had sold the precious heirloom for money to survive after being abandoned by every man in her life. If I were to guess, it was likely both. Now, at some point after this, he obtained Ravenclaw's diadem, and I'm sure by now you figured out the link between these 3 items. Slytherin's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, Ravenclaw's diadem. Tom Riddle, like Harry Potter, found Hogwarts to be a haven from the torture of his previous existence. Hogwarts gave him everything he could never get from the orphanage he grew up in. As such, he has a soft spot in his heart for the castle and all its secrets, including a few rooms he believed only he knew about, the Chamber of Secrets and the Room of Requirement. Now, apart from Hepzibah Smith, the deaths to create these Horcruxes started being mostly randos that Tom came across, suggesting that he was eager to turn these into Horcruxes as soon as possible. However undramatic the murders were, the hiding places were far from it. Hufflepuff's cup was hidden in Gringotts in a vault of an ancient pureblood family. Ravenclaw's diadem was hidden in Hogwarts itself when Tom visited for one of the last times before he started his magical war in an attempt to get a job as defense against the arts professor. Now, it is suggested that Tom thought he was the only one who knew about the room of requirement. However, the form the room takes when one asks for a place to hide something was described as having things from generations upon generations. I find it hard to believe that the diadem was the very first thing in this room, especially when, in the books, it was close enough to the top of these piles of items for Harry to use it as a marker to locate his potions textbook as he intended to retrieve it again. But, as we mentioned before, Tom was a diva and might have thought that the other objects in the room didn't mean anything, or that even if a few people knew about it, surely not enough people were clever enough to find it, and even less who would destroy it. Slytherin's locket was hidden in a cave where something happened in his youth. We're never told what, but it was enough to thoroughly traumatize the other children who went with him, and it was enough that Tom wanted to mark the location as a starting point for his own path to greatness. It's perhaps fitting that he chose Slytherin's locket to hide here, an item linked not only to his heritage as the heir of Slytherin, but also a means of Merope keeping herself alive long enough to give birth to him. I think I've rambled about these items long enough for you guys to have perhaps noticed what I'm about to put in front of you. There's something missing. Slytherin's locket, Ravenclaw's diadem, Hufflepuff's cup. Where's Gryffindor? One might think that, as not only a Slytherin but the heir of his legacy, that he might not want something of Gryffindor's acting as a Horcrux. But I think in this case his collector mentality would likely overthrow any schoolboy grudges. If he was a Hogwarts founding member, he was going to help Voldemort stay alive. Even better to have the man opposed to his ancestor unwittingly help his enemy's heir stay alive. So, why didn't Voldemort have an item of Gryffindor's as a Horcrux? My theory? He did. There are two items referred to in the books as having belonged to Godric Gryffindor. Firstly is the Sorting Hat. I doubt very much that this is a Horcrux for many reasons, the least of which not being that Voldemort himself tried to destroy the hat during the Battle of Hogwarts. No, I propose that the item Voldemort used as a Horcrux was the Sword of Gryffindor! Sorry, inside joke. The Sword of Gryffindor, the Sword of Gryffindor! Yes, that was described as having been lost until it nearly gave Harry a concussion when it popped out of the sorting hat in his second year to help him defeat the basilisk. It's likely that the sword was found and hidden by the very man whose legacy it would go on to defeat. But before we get into the particulars, let's continue and I'll show you why I believe the Sword of Gryffindor is needed to fill in some other missing pieces. So let's get back to Voldemort's ambition for collecting Horcruxes. So he hears this little prophecy about a boy born as the 7th month dies, whose parents have thwarted his efforts 3 times, who is the only one with the power to kill him. Now, he hasn't finished all 7 of his Horcruxes yet, but wouldn't it be poetic to make the 7th and last Horcrux, the last piece in his ambition to become immortal, be created at the death of the only one who could have defeated him? Now, we all know that this child was Neville Longbottom. Well, it could have been Neville anyway, but Voldemort seemed, by Dumbledore's speculation, to be more concerned about the half-blood child than the full-blood, likely because, although it was unlikely he ever admitted this to his followers, he himself was half-blood. So Voldemort focused on Harry as being the one that was the biggest threat to him. If he didn't intend on killing baby Neville as an extra insurance, he's a fool. But I suspect, given that it takes Voldemort over a year to find and attempt to kill Harry, that he intended to make the child's death mean something more. The last Horcrux. But let's do the math here. How many Horcruxes do we know he's made at this point? The diary, the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem. That's only 5. He's too short. I will address this more later, but I think he intended on making the 7th Horcrux when he entered Godric's Hollow that night. Now, speculation aside, we do have to admit that on October 31st, 1981, Voldemort met his first death and created a Horcrux at the same time. But it's important to note that Voldemort did not know he created a Horcrux with Harry. His actions throughout the books prove that. He would not have been so obsessed with killing him if he thought for a moment that in doing so, he would be killing a part of himself. So when Voldemort comes back, regardless of what relationship canon says he had with Nagini, he knows he's one Horcrux short of his ideal, and makes her one as well. Keyword, one. He made Nagini one to replace the Horcrux he thought he'd failed to make on Halloween 1981. So, as I said, there should have been 8 Horcruxes, including Harry at least. 7 Voldemort intended to make, and 1 he did not. So, you may be worried that there may be a piece of Voldemort's soul still out there. Fear not, Harry did his job, and when Voldemort fell in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, the last piece of his soul left this earth and was destroyed. So, what of my Sword of Gryffindor theory? Well, keep in mind how Horcruxes are meant to work. When Voldemort is killed, the part of his soul in a Horcrux will be activated so that he can live again. And that's exactly what happened when Lily gave her life for her son. One of the Horcruxes was activated, releasing the fragment of his soul within it. I believe it was the Sword of Gryffindor that Voldemort had found, created a Horcrux, and hidden. It's possible he hid it in the very same tree where he found the diadem of Ravenclaw, simply because when Quirrell found the fragment of Voldemort's soul trying to survive, it was in Albania, the same site of Helena Ravenclaw and the Bloody Baron's death. Or it could be entirely unrelated. Heck if I know. Now, it's plausible that when a Horcrux is destroyed, the item itself is meant to be destroyed. But remember that goblin-made items only take that which makes them stronger. Surely a Horcrux would have made it stronger, but when it was activated, it might have retained its form. And so it laid in hiding, until a young Gryffindor with the sorting hat on his head asked for help and drew the sword from its depths. And that boy was Neville Longbottom!